Mr. Mario and Luigi, it's so good to see you.
Yes, the family and I, when we were in Japan, we went to Universal Studios. The kids absolutely loved Mario World, which was insane. This video is not about that though. It is about the Sony A9 III and the brand new, very exciting 300mm 2.8. I just want to share some of my early thoughts. Obviously, I have not touched the camera, but I have had a lot of conversations with Mr. Seth Miranda, who has spent the whole day with the camera, and he has a lot of thoughts as well. And he has been hands-on. They have been able to play with the camera, shoot the camera, and have a really good session with it. Now, the first three highlines out of this: one, it is the first global shutter that we have seen in this space. Now, they do exist in some cine cameras, but we have never seen it in the hybrid mirrorless photography / video space. This is a first. 35mm, here it is, global shutter, and it's huge. And for those of you that don't know what that means, currently shutters actually scan. They actually scan the pixels. They do it very quickly, of course. And the Z8, that's why it's here, and the Z9 is currently the fastest in the market and will continue to be the fastest in the market until this thing actually ships. And my next point is, it is not shipping for 5 or 6 months. The Z8 and the Z9 will hold this position unless we see something from Canon, the R1, which is a conversation we'll have a little bit later in this video. And they're right now the fastest reading sensors. They scan the fastest in the market. And of course, as we understand, they are the first cameras to not have a mechanical shutter. Of course, this is now happening with the A9 III, and it's not coming out for another 6 months. So right now, for the next 6 months, Z8 and Z9 will hold that mantle, and we will see what the A9 III has in store. So it is a global sensor. The entire 24.6 megapixels is captured in one go. Every single pixel is captured and buffered and recorded and goes off to the card. So this is an enormous amount of data. Now, the third really big thing about this is its price. It is $5,999 US. And this makes it more expensive than a Z9 at $5,500 US. And obviously it makes it more expensive than a Z8, which is $3,999. Now, another super duper interesting thing about the A9 III, with this global shutter, what that means is we don't get banding because every single pixel is being captured at once. Now that is super cool. And another really, really interesting thing for photographers that use a lot of strobe, a lot of flash photography, and they want unlimited creativity, you can fire your flash at any shutter speed, and the maximum shutter speed is 1/80,000th of a second. You can't maintain that 1/80,000th of a second for long, and it drops back to 16,000th of a second. So there's some interesting caveats going on here. It will also shoot RAW 24 megapixels at 120 frames per second. And that sounds amazing. And look, it is amazing. The best that this can do is at 120 frames per second is 11 megapixel JPEG. Look, it's hard to say if you're in sports and you're actually shooting the Olympics and you've just got to file your shots. Are you pumping that stuff out in RAW, or are you pumping that stuff out in JPEG? I think some people will work in JPEG when you're working at that sort of speed, just due to how quickly they've got to file stuff. But of course, at the end of the day, photographers do want access to RAW. So that is an amazing achievement to do that at 24 megapixels at 120 frames per second. But there is a bit of a caveat there. You can only do it for 1.5 seconds. I think it's 1.6 seconds.
Well, we can do it without trade-offs. We can do it with full autofocus, full subject recognition. We're going to be able to shoot for 1.6 seconds, which is 192 frames. We can shoot in 14-bit RAW. So if you're shooting RAW plus JPEG at 120 frames per second, that's 6 gigabytes.
And then the buffer's full. And that 120 frames per second also comes with pre-capture. Now, pre-capture can go back 1 second, like we see with the Z8 or a Z9 and even the ZF and some other brands of cameras. If you go back a second, then you can only shoot for 0.6 of a second after that if you're going at 120 frames per second. And a point of interest around this camera is base ISO is 250 going up to 25,600. It also has expanded ranges. Another interesting thing is it is not dual gain. No question, technology-wise, delivering the first global shutter, delivering the fact that we can have like no rolling shutter. That's what that means. No rolling shutter, no banding, and you can flash sync at any speeds. These are kind of the highlight features of this sensor. Now they are very use case specific. It's not really relevant to a lot of photographers, those 3 points. There's an enormous gamut of use cases and photographers that do not need this technology. But for those that use it, it's really exciting, but it is expensive. And I suppose that's something that we will just see how the market bears it out. Now, what I'm really interested in discussing, because here we have this brand new technology, it's here, it's arrived, and of course, with the A9s previous, they brought the first stacked sensors, which weren't global, but they were the fastest that we saw. And then that technology has trickled to cameras like the Sony A1 and of course the Z8 and the Z9. What's going off in my head is, okay, so Sony, they've got their camera, it's going to be ready for the Olympics next year, the A9 III. Will we get an A1 II also slotting in before the Olympics? I kind of doubt it, because this is aimed at sports and wildlife. That's what this camera is aimed at, and I think that's what their push will be. So I don't think we'll see an A1 II before the Olympics. We might, but I kind of feel like we won't. But will they give us a global 50 megapixel camera? Is that possible? Will it happen? But an even larger, more pressing question is, where are Canon? Where is the R1? Now this really shows us, and I have speculated a little bit on my videos and even more behind the scenes, that I think that the R1, if they're going to be more than a Z8 or a Z9 or an A1, it needs to be a global shutter. Well, here it is. We're seeing it at 24 megapixels. Is it possible? Is it possible for anyone to get a global shutter out in something that's higher res, in something that's 45 megapixels like an R5, a Z8 or a Z9, or even at 50 megapixels? Is that why the R1's taking so long? Because we can see with the A9 III, even so it's ridiculously fast, we are not getting a lot of frames coming out of that camera before the buffer's full, and then they write to the card. Now we're going to talk about the card in a minute, because that's a really interesting choice by Sony, which is another little bit of a head scratcher. So will the R1 be global? Is that what we're waiting for? I would have to think at this point in time, I think that might be what we're waiting for with the R1, and Canon are doing their version, or they're working out how to do it. We're not sure. We're not sure where that sensor might come from. So R1, for it now to impress the market, it definitely has to be more than a Z8 or a Z9. It definitely has to be there. So I think we all of us, really interested to see what the Canon R1 will be. Let's go back to the A9 III. So when you're shooting 120 frames per second and you get your 1.6 seconds, that adds up to 6 gigabytes in that amount of time. That's a huge amount of data. Then the camera has to slow down or stop and write to the card. It's really difficult to understand why Sony have not used faster cards. They are using the previous generation CFexpress Type A, and they're not using the latest gen, which is the 4.0 specification, which was announced 3 or 4 months ago. There are already cards shipping for CFexpress Type B in this 4th gen. Even so, there's no cameras that use it yet. The theoretical maximum limit of a CFexpress Type B Gen 4 is 4 gigabytes per second. And this camera needs to write at 6 gigabytes per second if you just want it to keep going at full speed. Now that's 120 frames per second. So obviously we could get something like 80 frames per second or 70 frames per second and just keep writing to the card if they had chosen to use CFexpress Type B Gen 4, which exists and cards exist in the market. Now you might say, but it's only just been ratified. But yes, Sony, Nikon, and everybody else are part of the ratification team, and this specification would have been coming for a number of years. So Sony knew about it. So it's really interesting to me that Sony have decided to go with CFexpress Type A previous generation, which I think caps out at 1 gigabyte per second. It's just a strange move to me. It feels to me like they've deliberately throttled the camera. And my guess is, if you're going to run a 24 megapixel global sensor at 120 frames per second and just sort of sustain that indefinitely, a bit like the Z8 can shoot its compressed high efficiency star with fast cards, 20 frames per second, and you can just keep shooting. You can just leave your finger on the button and you can just keep going. There's kind of no limit if you have the right card. My conjecture here is that the A9 III actually can't, it wouldn't be able to do that. And so they have imposed a limit by way of the card that they have chosen to use. It just can't shoot at 120 frames per second for 10 seconds or 20 seconds or 30 seconds. It can't do it. It's either going to drain the battery too fast or it's going to overheat or whatever. And one way of people never being able to test that is simply it stops at 1.6 seconds. And that's fine. Like, all I'm doing here is logically going through why have they used CFexpress Type A, the previous generation, when CFexpress Type B or CFexpress Type A Gen 4, well, it's in the market, it exists, it's ratified, it's a standard. And I simply think the camera can't do it. It can't go beyond that sort of 1.6 seconds at 120 frames per second due to battery life or heat or whatever. But they're probably the main two things. Because we know that RAM can run very quickly and hard drives can run very quickly. They could have simply put a larger buffer in the camera. If the buffer's 6 gigabytes, which is what they're saying is the amount of data that's captured in that time, then they could have given users 3 seconds by doubling that RAM. And sure, that RAM's expensive, but we're talking about a $6,000 camera here. I think they could have doubled it. They've given us state-of-the-art technology, global shutter, and all of the advancements that come with it. They've given you a spec of 120 frames per second. It can do it, but it can't sustain it. And that's fine, because it's still bananas. Now, we've talked about what this means for Canon and the R1. What about Nikon? Well, we can begin to speculate now that the Z9, which is what we're shooting on here, now that it is 2 years old, it's hard to believe 2 years has passed since that came out. And thus, the Z9 II, I think, has a really good chance of being a global shutter. I still think it's probably 2 years away. And I also don't see there being any bump in resolution. I think we can safely say that today 45 megapixels is an absolute sweet spot, an all-rounder sweet spot where you get high resolution images, you get 8K video, you get good APS-C cropping, just under 20 megapixels. It really just has the sweet spot for everything, including being less of an impact on diffraction. Could we see in 2 years' time a global 45 megapixel Z9 II? I absolutely think there's a good chance of it. I would put even money on that. And if it's not global, it will definitely be much faster than it is today, because the sensors that's in the Z8 and Z9, we're in essence talking about technology that might be 4, 5 years old since the first ones were operational and running in a prototype. A very good chance in the Z9 II world that we have our first global shutter Nikon. Makes sense to me. Credit where credit is due. The astonishing A9 III, which has bleeding edge technology, and for certain use cases, having a global shutter is extraordinarily helpful when it comes to banding and when it comes to being able to fire your strobes at any shutter speed. Now, I've used the Z9 for, well, almost 2 years, and rolling shutter, even when photographing something like helicopter rotor blades, I haven't seen it. But there's no question that Nikon and Canon will continue to advance what they're doing. And if they're not global, they will be way faster than this Z8 or the Z9, the R3 are today, because we've had years of advancement. And here we are, the Z8 and the Z9 will continue to be glass-leading cameras until the A9 III arrives. But let's just keep in mind the A9 III is 24 megapixels and these cameras are 45. So depending on your use case, the Z8 and the Z9 still might be more what you need. And again, global shutter and the advantages that it brings, which is no strobing and any shutter speed with your strobes, yeah, that's great for people that have that use case and have deep pockets to buy it. But if you don't have pockets that deep, a Canon R5 or a Nikon Z8, they might fit the bill because they're both very fast cameras, with the Z8 being the faster of those two. Congratulations, Sony, on the A9 III, again, bringing us brand new technology. It's still 5 or 6 months away. We're yet to see the fine detail. How is it at high ISOs? What's it like for dynamic range? How noisy is it? There's always conversations around the fact that mechanical shutterless sensors are harder to work with than sensors with shutters, and this one's the fastest that we've seen in this category. And all those details are off the table at this point in time, so we'll have to talk more about them when they arrive. And what's battery life when it's running this crazy 120 frames per second in 14-bit RAW? Lots of interesting questions to be answered. Well done, Sony, for getting it out there. And also, an exciting new lens, the 300 2.8 G Master lens is out. For someone who has worked with all of the new Nikons, I'm about to get the new 600 in my hands any second. It's great to see. It's light, it's balanced, it's fast, it's sharp, fantastic. Got to get these lenses out. Every company will get them out. A final note on what Sony has brought to the table with this announcement day is minor firmware updates for the Sony A1 and the A7S III. They are nothing like the firmware updates we've seen with the Z9, but at least they're bringing a little bit more to the table to their users that committed to their flagship and then found that their flagship camera was, over time, actually missing quite a lot of features that were being added to cameras that have come out since 2021. So it's interesting to see. I don't know how far they're going to go. They haven't finalized that firmware. That's coming next year. And speaking of firmware, I will finish this video by saying, what might Nikon do with, say, the Z9? Now, I want to remind everybody that the Z9 shoots 12-bit RAW video, 8K, 8.3K, which is the full frame, at 60 frames per second. So let me say that again. The Z9 and the Z8 currently shoot 60 frames per second, raw, 12-bit video. So it does it now, and it maintains autofocus and exposure through all of that. Would it be possible, if there was a firmware 5 or 6, who knows, would it be possible that Nikon give us either 60 frames per second, full frame, 45 megapixels, 12-bit RAW, or I don't know whether HE Star, which compresses the files down to 60% of their original size, and could they do that at 14-bit? So let me say that clearly. We get 14-bit files at 60 frames per second, full frame, 45 megapixels in HE Star. Are either of those options possible? Again, to reiterate, the camera already shoots, you and I, any of us can already shoot 12-bit video at 60 frames per second in 8.3K using the entire sensor. Any of us can do that today. The pipeline seems to be there, and certainly if I was Nikon, I would be holding that capability in my back pocket until the A9 III launched, and then I might pop that out maybe early next year in the days or weeks before the A9 III actually ships. Now, if that's possible, that's a really big deal. Who knows? I got no idea. It's an interesting question. All right, everybody, I would love all of your thoughts about all of that. It's a lot of information. The A9 III is very exciting technology. It's global. I think Sony are clearly pushing things to the absolute limit with this camera. And oh, another thing to add, they've added their first function button ever, which is so exciting. And they've admitted that they needed to improve their ergonomics.
Every generation of camera, you always see tweaks, you always see improvements. And we've had a big improvement on this camera in terms of the grip, in terms of the way it feels. It feels better than any camera we've had before, to me. And then we've even changed the placement of the shutter button. So instead of being more on the top, it's more natural to your hand, so you have less fatigue throughout the day.
So that's two other really exciting things to see Sony do. Finally, some function buttons on the front, which is a good place for them. There is only one, not three, like we have on a Z9. And improved ergonomics. But we'll see. We'll see when we actually get one in the hand. Love to know all of your thoughts about all of that. It's been so good to see you. And if this is your first time here, I'd love to see you again. So please do subscribe, please share, and please like. All right. Bye for now. Luigi!